This is a sensitive topic, and many of us have become polarized. But we need to talk. So I want to ask for some compassion for me, because it's a bit scary to stand up here talking about this. Like you, sometimes I feel anger because I don't like the way our world is going. My wife tells me that I get too angry sometimes. I mean to be sedate today, but if you see any emotion at all, please understand and remember it's not against you. My intention today is to present some historical facts for your consideration that may help us produce a more informed and productive dialogue. So thank you so much for coming and your patient attention. If you find this talk interesting and you want to check out some of the documentation and the materials that we have for you on the topic that I will present today, please visit managementofreality.com, where you will find books, articles, videos, etc. And with no further ado, I'll get started. Okay. So I start with this. Peace is when the two sides of a controversy can talk to each other. And the prophet of peace that I like the most, at least from recent times, is Marshall Rosenberg, who invented an entire science of how we can talk to each other. His method is called nonviolent communication, and it's actually based on the ideas of Gandhi. This method of communication, this science of communication is so wonderful that Marshall Rosenberg, among many other great successes, was able to get two groups in Nigeria that had been killing each other to start talking to each other. I think if that was possible, then I think Westerners who disagree about what is happening in Gaza can also talk to each other. Rosenberg said that, this is a quote, that what evidence is there that we've adequately empathized with another person? First, when an individual realizes that everything going on within has received full empathic understanding, they will experience a sense of relief. This is a physical consequence. We can become aware of this phenomenon by noticing a corresponding release of tension in our own body. So it's also an interactive thing, okay? When you produce peace in another, you feel peace yourself. And to listen is to heal. Most people never have the experience of another person really listening to them. When it finally happens, when they get this rare experience of someone really interested in what they have to say, it's an actual physical experience. It's a healing experience. Another prophet of peace that I like is Buster Benson, who wrote a beautiful book called The Art of Productive Disagreement. And Buster Benson says, how do you use this really important skill we have, communicating with each other, to actually grow as humans, to get insight about the world, to enjoy each other's company, to do all these things that actually make us feel closer together, make us feel like we live more meaningful lives? That's the art of productive disagreement. And he identifies three ingredients that are key to get ourselves to productive disagreements. Declare the common ground. In other words, what is it that you fundamentally share with the person you're speaking with? What type of disagreement are you having? Because these can be of different forms, and it's very easy to confuse one kind of disagreement with another. And then, don't push. If you think back to your own experience, I think you'll agree with me that you've never really seen this happen, where you're having a discussion with somebody else, and all of a sudden the other person says, oh my God, you're right, I've completely changed my mind. I don't think you've ever had this experience. So don't try to produce it. It's not going to happen. Don't push. What he recommends is listen, because when you try to listen and understand the other person, this produces reciprocity. The other person is so grateful that you listen to them that then they feel like, well, maybe they should listen to you too in response, right? And then you can if you do all three things, you can have a productive disagreement. Now, what type of disagreements can we be confusing? he identifies three different kinds, fundamental kinds of disagreements. One is about what is useful, another kind is about what is true, and another is about what is meaningful. So these are disagreements about policy in the case of what is useful, facts in the case of what is true, and values in the case of what is meaningful. And you really want to do this stuff because identifying precisely what kind of disagreement you're having is simultaneously what's going to allow you to declare the common ground, to find out what you're not disagreeing about. And this gets you, this effort to establish what it is you are and aren't disagreeing about, it gets you out of the conversation and into the meta conversation. Now you're talking about the conversation. And whenever we do that, we reduce the tension, okay? When you're completely engaged and attached to what you're saying and what you believe and the thing you're trying to convince the other person about, then you're not in the meta conversation, you're in the conversation. And it's very difficult to step back from your own emotions. But when you start talking about the conversation, all of a sudden you take a little distance and it becomes possible to cool down a little bit. Oh, wait a minute, what is it that you're doing with what you said? What are you really doing? You know, that kind of thing. So if we can do that, we will have more productive disagreements. Now this is really important because, as I said before, we often believe we're having one kind of disagreement when it is a disagreement of an entirely different kind. So in fact, you were fighting about something that you really didn't need to fight about a lot of the time, right? You were actually agreeing, you just didn't know that you were agreeing because you didn't take the time to do this. I'll give you an example that I've seen in my own experience a million times. Somebody says, I think global warming is entirely natural. When somebody says this, a lot of us hear that person saying something completely different. And the rejoinder is often, what, you don't care about the planet? Notice, this is a confusion between two different kinds of disagreements. The first person is talking about what they think is true. And the second person thinks they heard a statement about what is meaningful, okay, about values. So what do Westerners agree on? What do we all fundamentally share as, let us say, a bedrock, ground principle for moral reasoning? Scholars of moral cognition have identified the ethic of autonomy as a mode of reasoning, of moral reasoning, that Westerners predominantly share. So that's what I'm going to call our moral ground. Now, what is the ethic of autonomy? The ethic of autonomy is when you try to think about moral issues by asking these kinds of questions. Has an individual been harmed? Will an individual be harmed? Okay? When you're concerned about possible or actual harm to individuals, then you are applying the ethic of autonomy. The basic principle behind the ethic of autonomy is that every human individual, you, me, everyone, is precious and sacred. Every single one of us, no exceptions. That's the ethic of autonomy. If something produces harm to individuals, we call that evil. And in order to be good, to be an ethical person, you have to be protecting individuals from harm. Okay? Now, I think both sides in the current controversy over the Hamas-Israel war are invoking the ethic of autonomy. On the pro-Israeli side, there is concern for harm to individuals. And on the pro-Palestinian side, there is concern for harm to individuals. So what would someone like me say to the pro-Palestinian to increase the probability of a productive disagreement instead of a fight? Well, I would first declare the zone of agreement, which is what I'm trying to do right now. And I will do it as Buster Benson recommends. So first I will say what I think is true and I think the other side agrees with. The Arab Palestinians are suffering. And then I will say what is meaningful that I also think the other side agrees with, which is that it is a moral imperative to fix that. Because what's going on is not good for the Arab Palestinians, obviously. This is very bad for the Arab Palestinians. We've got to do something about it. So where is the disagreement? I think the disagreement is, at least with me, is on what is useful. What is the right policy? But this needs to be phrased in terms of the ethic of autonomy. So I'm going to try to do that. The question is, what is the best policy to protect Arab Palestinian individuals from suffering harm? I will try to answer that question, and then that will feed into the title question that invited you to this talk. What do the Israelis owe to the Arab Palestinians? And that will be my conclusion. In order to do this, I want to establish a benchmark. What do I mean by that? I want to take the strongest pro-Palestinian position, and I will do all of the following. First, I will grant all of the assumptions of the pro-Palestinian side, every single one of them. B, I will suppose that the Arab Palestinians are the only people that matter. In other words, I will only consider the issue of harm to the Arab Palestinians, period. C, I will consider the most ambitious policies supported by the pro-Palestinian camp. And D, I will ask, will these policies better protect the Arab Palestinians from harm? In a little more detail. First, what do I mean by granting all of the assumptions of the pro-Palestinian side? I mean this. First, that Arab Palestinian identity is socially real, of long standing, and geographically and culturally meaningful. Second, that the Arab Palestinians have been wronged. And third, that Israeli society and government bear some responsibility for that. B, what do I mean that I will reason as if only the Arab Palestinians matter? I mean this. For this benchmark, I will evaluate outcomes only in terms of their effects on Arab Palestinians. That's it. That's the only thing I will consider. C, I will consider the most ambitious pro-Palestinian proposal that has been aired in the context of this current controversy. And that's the proposal of a free Palestine from the river to the sea. Now, not everybody knows what that means. There have been some interviews with protesters where we have seen that they're not exactly sure which river they're talking about or what sea. So I have to be careful and specify. What is meant by a free Palestine from the river to the sea is this river over here, the Jordan River, and the Mediterranean Sea. So a free Palestine from the river to the sea translates into erasing the state of Israel and building a Palestinian state on the territory of the current state of Israel. So that's the proposal I will consider. In D, I will ask this question. If Israel disappears and a Palestinian state is created from the river to the sea, will that keep Arab Palestinian individuals from harm? Remember, I am only considering effects on the Arab Palestinians for the purposes of this talk. Now, to answer this question, we must first ask who will govern an Arab Palestinian state? In all probability, that state will be governed by PLO Fatah. PLO Fatah is now better known as the Palestinian Authority. It won't be governed probably by Hamas. It's possible that Hamas will now be completely destroyed, so it won't be around to run any future Palestinian state. And it won't be run by Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is internationally recognized as a terrorist organization. The organization that has participated in the diplomatic process, ostensibly directing us towards the creation of a Palestinian state, has been PLO Fatah. That's the organization, as I said, that we now call the Palestinian Authority, and it's the organization that governs Arab Palestinians living in Judea and Samaria, and before 2007, it was also running the lives of Arab Palestinians in Gaza. It is well understood that Hamas and Hezbollah are proxies of Iran, which out loud promises to exterminate the Israeli Jews, which again creates an obstacle for Hezbollah or Hamas being the future government of a Palestinian state. But at least in the diplomatic space that has created what we call the Oslo peace process, no such obstacle exists for PLO Fatah. And actually, various rulers around the world, even in the context of this current war, have been calling for, as soon as the war ends, we should go ahead and create the Palestinian state. And of course, what they're proposing is that PLO Fatah should be the government of that state. This is the famous handshake in the White House lawn that sealed the signatures for the Oslo peace process. That's Yasser Arafat on the right and Yitzhak Rabin on the left. The Oslo peace process marks a watershed in recent history because what it did was bring into the Jewish state, into Israel, this organization, PLO Fatah, as I said, to run the lives of Arab Palestinians in Gaza, Judea, and Samaria. So I'm going to rephrase the question. The question is, will Arab Palestinian individuals be protected from harm in a PLO Fatah state? That's the question. To answer, we must ask, how has PLO Fatah treated the Arab Palestinians up to now? So I will give you a brief history of PLO Fatah. First, why do I say PLO Fatah? Originally, PLO and Fatah are two separate organizations. Al-Fatah, created in the 1950s by the Arab Higher Committee, and PLO, or the Palestine Liberation Organization, created in 1964 by Gamal Abdel Nasser, back then the dictator of Egypt. So, just a little trek down academic history. This is an article from the Middle East Forum. I'm going to need my glasses here. It says, in 1964, Nasser created, with Soviet assistance, the Palestine Liberation Organization and appointed Ahmad Shukeri to be the chairman. It was a shrewd ploy to give the Egyptian president, that's Nasser, full control of this cause, as Yasser Arafat's rival Fatah organization, they were rivals back then, established a few years earlier, quickly pointed out. Now, this is a quote from Howard Sakar, History of Israel. He says, in February 1967, the PLO leader Ahmad Shukeri was wounded in an assassination attempt. For the while, as a result, the organization was at least partially immobilized by factional intrigues. Not so a rival and even more radical Palestinian group in Syria, the Fatah, or Arab Liberation Movement, organized several years earlier by veterans of the Mufti's former Arab Higher Committee. By 1970, the Palestine Liberation Organization had been seriously crippled, and its leader, Ahmed Shukeri, had been forced into retirement. Since then, the PLO had experienced less a revival than a total reincarnation of membership and purpose under the leadership of Yasser Arafat. So, he says the PLO in its resurrected form was almost entirely Fatah dominated, and Arafat himself served as president of its executive. So originally two different organizations, but then there's an assassination attempt against the leader of the PLO, and Fatah basically takes it over. Okay, so it continued to represent itself to the world as a coalition of guerrillas or terrorist groups, whatever your predilection. But in reality, it was Fatah. Fatah called all the shots. Now, since Fatah calls all the shots, we should know a little bit more about the founder of Fatah, and that's the Mufti. The Mufti Haj Amin Al-Husseini, who is the father of the Palestinian movement, okay, the founding father of the Palestinian movement. He is the Grand Mufti because the British gave him that expanded title. So in the Ottoman Empire, the office of the Mufti was actually not such a big deal. The Mufti of Jerusalem during the Ottoman period, before the British took over that piece of land, had as his jurisdiction just the city of Jerusalem. And he didn't have as many powers as the British would give the Grand Mufti. Right? Under the British, the Mufti of Jerusalem became the Grand Mufti because his powers extended over the entire Mandate territory. So the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem had the power over all of the Islamic schools, the madrasas, all the power over all of the mosques, so he could appoint and remove the teachers and the mullahs. He also could tax the Arab population in the Mandate territory, and he received a generous subsidy from the British Crown. Now, how did Husseini become the Mufti? Husseini became the Mufti after he demonstrated first in 1920, he organized a terrorist attack against the Jews of the Yishuv, of the Jewish community in the Mandate territory. This is the Al-Nevi Musa massacre. And it was after he demonstrated that he could organize such terrorist attacks that the British made him the Grand Mufti. How did this happen? The rules for the election of the Mufti that the British agreed with the Arabs stipulated that there would be elections among the Arabs living in the Mandate territory, and then the British would choose as Mufti whoever they wanted from among the first three places that came out in the voting. Husseini came in fourth. So what the British did is that they pressured the third place to remove himself from the running so that Husseini would end up being the third place, and then the British picked Hussein. And I think that's telling because, as I said, he had already demonstrated what he was capable of. As soon as he became the Grand Mufti in 1921, he organized another big terrorist attack. In 1929, yet another, so large that many Jews in Mandate Palestine thought they would be exterminated. And finally, the biggest attack of them all, from 1936 to 1939, which was baptized by the Arabs, the Arab Revolt, which included fighters that were coming in from Syria and Iraq, and weapons that were sent by Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. Now, what about that Arab Revolt? An interesting detail of that Arab Revolt is that Hajj Amin al-Husseini killed many more Arab Palestinians than he did Jews. Now, this is very interesting. This is the founding father of the Arab Palestinian movement. So the question is obviously why? Why was he killing so many Arab Palestinians? Why would he be killing more Palestinians than Jews? This is a quote from Zionism, False Messiah from Nathan Weinstock, who wrote this book as an anti-Zionist. But Weinstock was doing historiography. So even though he had a personal opinion that went against Zionism, he nevertheless recorded a lot of facts about what the experience of Arabs in Mandate Palestine was like. And he was a Marxist. So he felt obligated to report on the social structure of Arab society and the manner in which the people at the bottom of Arab society were being oppressed by the people at the top. Okay? As a good Marxist, he felt he needed to describe all that. And one of the things he pointed out was that during the so-called Arab Revolt from 1936 to 1939, Husseini's guerrillas executed what they called traitors. He puts it in quotes because Weinstock is aware that these people were not traitors at all. They just disagreed with Hussein, which is not the same thing. This is a quote from Maurice Perlman, who wrote an entire book on Hajj Amin al-Husseini immediately after World War II, when Husseini was still world famous. Soon after this, there would be a silence, a complete silence of several decades on Hajj Amin al-Husseini. All of the media and all of academia would stop mentioning Husseini completely. But in 1948, when Maurice Perlman wrote this book, Husseini was still world famous. He wrote about the Arab Revolt. The nucleus of the rebel army were groups of Arab nationalists who supported the Higher Committee, the Arab Higher Committee, and several bands of mercenaries from Syria and Iraq. A considerable number of the rank and file were innocent villagers who had been pressed into service at the point of a gun. They were financed by raids on villages and quote-unquote donations extorted from rich Arabs. Similar means were used to silence opposition from critical Arab leaders and newspaper editors. Now, what does this context mean? Well, it suggests at least that most of these Arab Palestinians didn't want to go out and kill Jews. If that had been an exciting thing for them, something that they thought was valuable and just, it wouldn't have been necessary for Husseini to direct terrorism against them, to force them to participate in terrorism against the Jews. And we see here that even the rich Arab Palestinians had to be coerced. Why might that be? And I think we should find this a little bit surprising in terms of the context that we are constantly hearing lately about what happens in Israel, right? And here's the statistic. This one comes from Kenneth Levin's The Oslo Syndrome. He says, the Arabs under the Grand Mufti and with Nazi encouragement initiated open rebellion in the Mandate. They targeted Jews, British officials and troops, and Arabs considered too accommodating of the Jews. Over the next 2 years, the Mufti's forces killed more than 400 Jews and several thousand Arabs. That's a very big difference. He was killing many, many, many more Arabs than he was killing Jews. Why? Well, the question is really, why was it that he had so little support among the ordinary Arab Palestinians for his terrorism against the Jews? And the answer is because most Arabs didn't want to kill Jews because they understood that their oppressors were the Arab ruling class. So the social structure of Arab society in Mandate Palestine in the early 20th century was feudal. The thing it looked most like was the Middle Ages in Europe. So you had these huge landed estates, and in these landed estates, which were owned by these lords, actual lords, the land was being worked by impoverished peasants who, we should really call them slaves, because the payment they got for the work was such a pittance that it was never enough for daily life. They could never buy what they needed to stay alive. So what would happen is that they would get loans from the Lord, right? So you can't survive on what you're getting. So you ask your Lord, hey, could you give me a little money? Loan me a little money. And the Lord would say, of course, at 50% interest, or 60% interest, or 70, 80% interest. So of course, these debts could never be repaid. And the consequence of not being able to repay your debts was that you couldn't leave. So in effect, they became slaves. Here is the anti-Zionist Nathan Weinstock telling us about that. He says, the Felahim, these are the peasant agriculturalists, the Arab peasants, says, attached to the land, were mercilessly exploited by the big landowners and burdened with levies and taxes. In the village, the peasant was at the mercy of the sheikh, the governor, the farmer general to whom the taxes were farmed out, and the merchants and usurers who vied with each other for the prize of crushing him. Traditionally, the villager had only one means of escaping this misery: nomadism, the peasant's last resort. The Felahim formed the mass of the population, nearly 70%, living in the country's 850 Arab villages. The fierce exploitation which they suffered, he says, we've already described their poverty and the fierce exploitation which they suffered at the hands of the landowners and the usurers. There was hardly any hope of escaping recurring indebtedness, growing ever worse until they lost their land. And the biggest landowning family? That was the Husseinis. So the founding father of the Arab-Palestinian movement was in fact the chief oppressor of the humble, ordinary Arab Palestinian peasants. Now, why do I share all this? I share all this because if we care about the Arab Palestinians, then it doesn't matter who is oppressing them. What matters is that they are oppressed. And whoever is oppressing them should be called to account. Of course, a lot of people think that the Zionist Jews were also oppressing the Arab Palestinians. But I quote from Anita Shapira, who writes, "The Zionists argued that one should act to promote the rights of the Arab worker and better his lot and avoid placing him at any disadvantage. It was prohibited to expel the Fellahim when they purchased lands, when the Jewish agency purchased lands in British Mandate Palestine." Why? Why was this the ideology of the Zionist immigrants? Well, in part because they were Jews, and in part because they were Marxists. The ideology of most of the immigrants coming in at this time was Marxism. And these were true believers. And what they thought was, well, we have to find a way to create solidarity with the Arab workers. I mean, we're escaping oppression in Europe. They're oppressed here. You know, we need to create a solidarity movement, Jews and Arabs together, against oppressors. But you don't have to take it from Anita Shapira. We can look at the anti-Zionist again. Nathan Weistock says, many Fellahim were displaced following purchases made by non-Jews. Say, for example, an Arab middleman or a moneylender who then sold the property acquired to a Zionist purchasing body. So whereas the Zionists had an ideology that said, hey, when we buy land, we can't just expel the Arab workers, you know, gotta give them jobs, gotta build solidarity with them. The middlemen buying Arab lands among themselves, you know, these were transactions between Arabs, they would expel the Arab workers before selling land to the Jews. There was nothing the Zionists could do about that. Nathan Weinstock, again the anti-Zionist, says, the repercussions on the Arab economy of the inflow of capital into Palestine and the country's economic expansion were felt in the long run. Agriculture advanced considerably during this period, when there were the beginnings of an evolution towards intensive farming. Arab orchards, which covered an area of 332,000 dunams, that's an Arab measure of area, in 1921, spread over 832,000 dunams in 1942. Cattle breeding and poultry rearing made rapid headway. There was an increase of the order of 60% in 13 years. The orange groves developed at great speed. 22,000 dunams of citrus fruit in 1922, 144,000 dunams in 1937. Vegetable production increased almost tenfold between 1920 and 1938. So what was happening was that in the transactions between the Jewish agency and Arab landowners who wanted to sell their land, the Arab slaves found freedom. They were released from the land. And now they could find employment in productive enterprises that the Zionists were creating and become employees instead of slaves, which was, of course, much better for them. And that was reflected, and the effect on every Arab was reflected in the growth of Arab agriculture and industry during this period. Because what the Zionist immigrants did in British Mandate Palestine is create an economic boom. And in fact, that economic boom attracted Arab immigrants from all over. In fact, the overwhelming majority of the people who now call themselves Arab Palestinians are immigrants from other places, just like the Jews in Israel. They're, descendants from immigrants, okay? Both populations are in this exact same situation. The overwhelming majority are descended from people who immigrated there. To get a sense for how true that is, in order to get the population of Arab Palestinian refugees that we now count today, the UN had to declare that an Arab Palestinian refugee is anyone whose ancestors immigrated to Mandate Palestine even just 2 years before the war of 1948. If you take away that definition, the population of Arab Palestinian refugees would dwindle to a very small number. But they had to use this rule because most of the people who call themselves Arab Palestinians are in fact descended from people who immigrated during the Mandate years. Weinstock says, in a period of economic boom and massive immigration, both Arab and Jewish, the scarcity of manpower and the intense tempo of construction favored the taking on of Arab workers. Moreover, a growing number of Palestinian Arabs found jobs in the public services. 18,000 in 1930, more than 30,000 in 1945. One should add to this those employed by concessionary companies, concerns in which the majority of capital was Jewish, but which were bound under their statutory provisions. These are statutory provisions created by the Zionist Jews themselves to take on a certain proportion of Arab workers. So the Arabs in Mandate Palestine were benefiting greatly from the arrival of Zionist Jews. And this helps explain why they didn't want to kill those Jews. In fact, most of them had immigrated there because the Jews had created an economic boom. They had come there looking for a better life. Okay, but isn't it at least true that the Zionist Jews were stealing Arab land by force? Not according to Haj Amin Al-Husseini. He is my authority on the question of whether the Jews stole the land of the Arabs in Mandate Palestine. How do I know this? How do I know that Husseini said that no Arab land had been stolen by the Zionist Jews? I know this because in the middle of the so-called Arab revolt, which again went from 1936 to 1939, and it was a series of terrorist attacks against Jews and Arabs, the British sent a commission to investigate what was going on. This was the Peel Commission, headed by Lord Peel. And as part of the investigations of the Peel Commission, Haj Amin Al-Husseini was called to give testimony. And he was interviewed by Sir Lord Hammond. And we have the record of the exchange, and this is how it went. Haj Amin Al-Husseini, the father of the Palestinian movement. In 1936, Husseini, Mufti of Jerusalem, launched his fourth great terrorist assault against the Jews of British Mandate Palestine. He called it the Arab Revolt. This violence lasted until 1939. In 1937, the British government sent a team to investigate, headed by Lord Peel. His mission was to establish what was happening and why. He called Husseini as witness. Sir Lord Hammond asked Husseini whether the problem was that Jews had taken Arab lands by force. Husseini replied, "In most cases, the lands were acquired. I mean forcibly acquired. Compulsory acquisition, as land would be acquired for public purposes. No, it wasn't. Not taken by compulsory acquisition? No. But these lands amounting to some 700,000 dunams were actually sold? Yes, they were sold, but the country was placed in such conditions as would facilitate such purchases." I don't quite understand what you mean by that. They were sold. Who sold them? Landowners. Arabs? In most cases, they were Arabs. Was any compulsion put on them to sell? If so, by whom? As in other countries, there are people who by force of circumstances, economic forces, sell their land. The Arab landowners who, according to Husseini, had been forced to sell their lands were the Effendi, the great feudal lords of the area. They did whatever they liked. Nobody forced them to sell. And they had sold their least productive lands at very high prices. In fact, Husseini's own family, among the largest Effendi landowners, was doing a brisk business with these sales.
The Husseinis first would threaten the small landowners with death if they dared commit the so-called national crime of selling land to Jews. Then they would buy these plots at fire sale prices, consolidate them, and resell them at extortionate prices to the Zionist Jews. Historian Nathan Weinstock explains, in other words, hyper-nationalist propaganda became a lucrative industry, indeed even an American-style racket for the Arab gentry.
What Nathan Weinstock describes as a racket is that Husseini, through a cousin, also a member of the Husseini family, was threatening the small landowners among the Arabs, right? So there were all kinds of different landowners. You had the big lords who had gigantic estates worked on by lots of slaves. And then you had middling landowners, and then people who had tiny plots of land. So what the Husseini family would do is they would go to the small landowners, they would put a gun to their heads, and they would say, "Woe to you if you dare sell land to the Jews. But guess what? I'll buy it." So of course they would buy these lands, putting a gun to these people's heads for, bottom prices, and then they would consolidate the lands, turn them into bigger estates, and turn around and sell them at extortionate prices to the Jewish agency. So Husseini's thinking was, well, we're going to get these lands back anyway, because we're going to push the Jews out with terrorism. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get these lands for very little, forcing the small landowners to sell, consolidate them, sell them to the Jews, and with the money from the land sales, I will finance the terrorism against the Jews. And then when I push them back, I'll get the lands back. Meanwhile, the Arabs were suffering. Husseini organized his fourth terrorist attack against the Jews of the British Mandate. He coordinated his actions with Hassan al-Banna, founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini sent weapons. After the Arab revolt, Husseini traveled to Iran. I should explain. This is what Husseini did immediately after the Arab revolt. Okay? There's a slide there that I missed. I'm sorry. So immediately after the Arab revolt, the mayhem became so pronounced that the British felt they really had to do something about it. And so they tried to arrest him, and he escaped. He went to Iran first, and then to Iraq. And this is what he did in Iraq. But I should give you a little bit more context. Husseini, as I said before, was world famous. All over the Muslim world, his prestige was enormous. Many people believed that Husseini would be the next caliph. That's how important he was. So in different places that he went to, they would treat him as if he were already a head of state. And when he went to Iraq, they turned him into some kind of, like if he was a cabinet minister, and they gave him a budget, and they allowed him to order people about and so forth. And this is what he did. Then to Iraq, where, with the help of the Iraqi government, which sympathized with the Nazis, he organized a mass killing of the Iraqi Jews called the Farhud. Then he traveled to Rome and arrived finally in Berlin in October of 1941. Husseini was received with all honors by the Nazis. Hitler and Husseini sat to plan the extermination of the Jews in the Middle East, as registered in the Nazi minutes of the meeting. The Führer then made the following statement to the Mufti, enjoining him to lock it in the uttermost depths of his heart. Germany's objective would then be solely the destruction of the Jewish element residing in the Arab sphere under the protection of British power. Shortly thereafter, in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee, a conference was held. Important officials of the Third Reich decided there that they would kill all of the European Jews. The question is, did Husseini have something to do with this decision? After the war, at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal, evidence was presented to consider Husseini's part in this decision. The witness was Dieter Wisliceny, right-hand man to Adolf Eichmann, the acknowledged director and administrator of the extermination of the European Jews. Wisliceny testified as follows about the Mufti Husseini. According to my opinion, the Grand Mufti played a role in the decision of the German government to exterminate the European Jews, the importance of which must not be disregarded. He had repeatedly suggested to the various authorities with whom he has been in contact, above all before Hitler, Ribbentrop, and Himmler, the extermination of European Jewry. He considered this as a comfortable solution of the Palestine problem. He was one of Eichmann's best friends and has constantly incited him to accelerate the extermination measures. Wisliceny also stated the following: the Mufti is one of the originators of the systematic destruction of European Jewry by the Germans, and he has become a permanent colleague, partner, and advisor to Eichmann in the implementation of this program. In Nazi-occupied Yugoslavia, in Bosnia and Kosovo, Husseini oversaw the recruitment and training of Muslim troops for Heinrich Himmler's SS, troops that committed genocide against Serbs, Jews, and Roma. After the war, Husseini escaped to Cairo. With the blood of millions of Jews still fresh on European soil, the UN voted in 1947 to establish in the Middle East a state for the Jewish people. It also approved the creation of a Palestinian Arab state. No sooner had the vote been announced, Azam Pasha, Secretary General of the Arab League, announced with great excitement that the Arabs would make a new Holocaust. This will be a war of extermination and a momentous massacre which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacres in the Crusades. Haj Amin al-Husseini led the Palestinian Arab effort in this war of genocidal intent. The Jews, most of them civilians without military training and without heavy weapons, defeated the professional armies of the United Arab States, and they established their new state. Egypt and Jordan illegally occupied those territories which had been designated for a Palestinian Arab state and precluded the formation of that state. Gamal Abdel Nasser, leader of the Pan-Arab nationalist movement, seized power in Egypt in 1952. Nasser was obsessed by a single idea: Israel. Otto Skorzeny and dozens of aging Nazis did indeed trek to Cairo in the first years of Nasser's regime to prepare the Arabs for battle with the new Jewish state. Taking advantage of the presence of his Nazi colleagues in Cairo, the Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini made young Yasser Arafat, then living in Cairo, his protege. The Mufti secretly imported a former Nazi commando officer into Egypt to teach Mr. Arafat and other teenage recruits the fine points of guerrilla warfare. Mr. Arafat learned his lessons well. The Mufti was so proud of him, he even pretended the two of them were blood relations. Arafat and a few other adolescents formed the initial nucleus of Al-Fatah. Among them was Mahmoud Abbas, alias Abu Mazen, the current leader of the organization. Okay, so I think now we're getting a better picture of why there is so much violence directed by the Arab-Palestinian movement leaders against ordinary Arab Palestinians. The leaders are too interested in killing Jews to care about the Arab Palestinians. Notice what PLO Fatah does to the Arab Palestinians in 1992. This is before the Oslo Agreement. So the perception that the media and academia has created about the Oslo so-called peace process is that PLO Fatah transformed itself, right? So it used to be a terrorist organization. It had organized many terrorist attacks against innocent Jewish civilians and civilians from other countries. But as a result of the conversations and the diplomacy of the so-called Oslo peace process, there was an ideological transformation, and they decided that they would abandon terrorism and would negotiate peace in exchange for a piece of territory. That's the, let us say, the official representation of the Oslo peace process. The Oslo Accords were signed in 1993 and 1994. This is 1992, right? So you think, oh, we're getting to the signature, they must be already transforming themselves. I mean, there must already be some kind of evolution, but this is what they were doing. To the Arab Palestinians, this was reported by Agence France Presse in 1992. On Tuesday, the body of a 30-year-old Arab mother of seven was dumped outside her home in Rafah refugee camp in Gaza. She gave birth to twins 2 months ago. PLO Black Panthers claimed responsibility. It was Arafat that killed her. On June 7th, after a wave of protests over the slaughter of dozens of alleged Palestinian Arab collaborators, supporters of Hamas and the main PLO faction, Fatah, distributed in Gaza the text of a Charter of Honor. A key element of the accord, of the Charter of Honor, signed by Hamas and PLO Fatah in solidarity against ordinary Palestinians, was a call to regulate the killing of collaborators, so-called, through reference to the highest levels of the Palestinian leadership in the territories. I should observe that when PLO Fatah and Hamas talk about any Arabs as being collaborators, officially what this means is that they're supposedly collaborating with the Israeli government against the terrorist organizations. Some of them do. But the majority of the people that get called collaborators are simply Arab Palestinians who don't agree with their totalitarian rulers. So they're conveniently called collaborators so that there's a kind of a nationalist excuse to kill them. Collaborator just means dissident. And this is post-Oslo. So this is immediately after the signatures that supposedly enshrined this alleged transformation of PLO Fatah from terrorism to negotiated peace. Reported in United Press International, another wire. It says, the Palestinian police force in the Gaza Strip will issue personal weapons to a select number of former prisoners, terrorists, released from Israeli jails so that they can protect themselves from revenge killings. So we've seen this many times. Any kind of concession that is supposedly extracted from PLO Fatah or from Hamas requires that terrorists who are already in Israeli jails be released, right? And the Oslo process was not different. This is a very old tradition. So when the Oslo Accords were signed, one of the things that happened as let us say, as a reward to PLO Fatah for participating in this process is that many PLO Fatah terrorists who were in Israeli jails purging their crimes were simply released. And it says here, the former inmates, those terrorists who were released, along with others who were deported by Israel and later allowed to return, were arrested for killing Palestinians suspected of collaborating with Israel. The police force says they remain targets for the family members of those they executed while Israel still occupied Gaza. We want to arm prisoners and returnees to allow them to protect themselves against any revenge taken by families of Palestinians killed for collaborating with Israel, said Rashid Abu Shabak, a senior leader of the PLO's mainstream Fatah faction in Gaza and a member of the Preventive Security Unit of the police force. So this is the police force created after the signing of the peace accords, distributing weapons to the terrorists released from Israeli jails so that they can protect themselves from the families of the people they murdered. During the Palestinian uprising or Intifada, more than 600 Palestinians from Gaza suspected of being collaborators with Israel were killed by armed members of different PLO and Islamic factions. Remember the Arab revolt? It's the same structure. These are Arab Palestinians who don't agree with PLO Fatah, who don't agree with terrorism and so on and so forth, who don't want a totalitarian government. What do they do with them? They go and they kill them. And this is 2 years after the signing of the Oslo so-called peace accords, 1996. It's the headline from The Guardian. The Palestinian Authority stands accused of corruption, extortion, and the intimidation of its people. The proliferation of largely unaccountable security forces seems to be out of control, and oppression is rife. David Hurst in Gaza reports on a state in the making apparently immune to criticism. Now, it's true, however, that in recent days, there are fewer Arab Palestinians getting killed for alleged collaboration than what was happening when the Mufti was around. Okay? When the Mufti was around, remember the Arab revolt, the biggest mayhem that the Mufti created, resulted in the Mufti's forces killing 400 Jews and several thousand Arabs. Okay? The numbers are not so large now because there has been a process of indoctrination over many decades. And that process of indoctrination has been poisoning the minds of Arab Palestinians. So there's fewer and fewer Arab Palestinians now who disagree with the leadership of PLO, Fatah, and Hamas. And I want to give you a taste of how this indoctrination works. And we know how it works because we have two very good organizations that are dedicated to trying to tell us what is happening. One is the Middle East Media Research Institute, MEMRI, and the other one is Palestinian Media Watch. And I encourage you to go to their websites because they specialize in reproducing material that is aired on Palestinian TV and translating that into languages that we speak so that we know what is going on. What I'm about to show you is a children's program for little girls, I don't think older than 4, maybe 5, who are being taught that the great ideal of their lives has to be growing up to kill Jews.
Palestinian television, under the control of the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, has been the main source of incitement against Israel and Jews in the past 20 years. Often overlooked by the international community and media, daily kids' television programming calls on Palestinian children to be martyrs and kill Jews and non-Muslims. We traveled to Jerusalem to meet with Itamar Marcus, the head of Palestinian Media Watch, to get a better insight into what sort of shows air on Palestinian television.
Palestinian Media Watch was established soon after the signing of the Oslo Accords, and the goal was to find out what the Palestinians were saying amongst themselves in Arabic, with a special focus on messages which they were giving to children.
شو بيسوي بالشرطي؟
بس الحرامي والبلد مشاكل
وبتطخ اليهود صح؟ انت بدك تصيري زيه؟ ان شاء الله لما تكبري. انا بطخ اليهود كلهم؟ كلهم؟ طيب.
We find that there are two different worlds. There's the English language world for foreign consumption, and there's the Arabic language world for internal consumption. And very often there are complete contradictions between what we tell the outside world and the hate and terror glorification messages to their own people.
سيكون في الجنة وكل جميع سيكتب له الله الثواب. هذا الأقصى لنا والقيامة لنا.
Some very brave Arab Palestinians are protesting against this, and I think they should get all of our support. They certainly aren't appearing too often in the media. They should be. This is Mossab Hassan Yusuf. Oh, forgive me. He shouldn't be there. That's let me see where. This is. Forgive me. He's not the author of that story. That story is by Bassem. Can't read. Thank you, Bassem Eid, who wrote an opinion piece for Newsweek. And what he said is, the chaos and desperation that led to this tragedy are direct outcomes of Hamas's governance, which prioritizes violence and killing Jews over the welfare of its population. As a Palestinian human rights activist deeply sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinian people and the complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I can tell you beyond the shadow of a doubt that the terrorist group Hamas is responsible for the suffering of Gazans. Now, Mossad Hassan Youssef, his testimony is, I believe, quite important, because Mossad Hassan Youssef is the son of one of the founders of the Hamas organization. And he really did have a transformation. He was arrested. He actually, not so much a transformation as a liberation, because even as a kid, according to his own autobiography, which I encourage you to read, he resisted the violence that even his own father directed against him as part of the, the kind of the training that they give these kids from an early age. And he says, how can you validate or approve the release of mass murderers back to the streets so they can carry a lot more terrorist attacks and hijack an entire society? He's referring to Gaza. Use hundreds of thousands as human shields. This is from a speech that he gave to the UN, which was reported almost nowhere. Now, finally, the question is, but weren't the Jews also oppressing the Arab Palestinians? Because this is what a lot of people believe. This is from 1977. The date is significant because this is exactly 10 years after the Jews in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza ended up being governed by the state of Israel. Because before the war of 1967, remember, Egypt was illegally sitting on Gaza, and Jordan was illegally sitting on Judea and Samaria. Judea and Samaria, forgive me, is what the media calls the West Bank. So here's some reporting from 1977, before anybody thought to propose the Oslo peace process. And this is what it says. Arab living standards in the West Bank have jumped more than 50% in the past 10 years, and employment has nearly doubled. In other words, in the 10 years that these people were blessed by Israeli control, living standards jumped more than 50%, and employment nearly doubled. Largely because of the 250 million annual trade that has grown up between the West Bank and Israel. The Israelis have also kept the Jordan River bridges open, allowing 1 million Arabs a year to cross and to keep their markets in Jordan for such products as olive oil, soap, and farm produce. The Israelis also allow the Arabs to elect their own officials, even though the winners are often radical activists. Still, the Arabs say they have never been more unhappy. Now, why were the Arabs unhappy? Because indoctrination had now been happening for several decades. But on the material question, the same process that we saw with the arrival of the Zionists in Mandate Palestine was going on here. Contact with the Jews, contact with the State of Israel was improving the material conditions of these Arab Palestinians. So what is my conclusion? I think a PLO Fatah state will be the worst thing for the Arab Palestinians. This is exactly what Mossad Hassan Youssef told me when I had the opportunity to ask him. I live in Mexico City. He was invited to give a big talk at one of the biggest synagogues in Mexico City. And at the end of his talk, somebody gave me the microphone so I could ask a question. And the question was, what do you think of this idea to create an Arab Palestinian state? And he said, thank you very much for that question. He said, I think an Arab Palestinian state would be the absolutely worst thing for the Arab Palestinians, because that state is going to be governed by terrorists who do nothing but pummel and crush the Arab Palestinians. So, do the Israeli Jews owe something to the Arab Palestinians? I think I'm about to surprise you, because my answer to this question is yes. I think the Israeli Jews owe something to the Arab Palestinians. And you know why? Because it was Israel that allowed PLO Fatah inside the Jewish state to govern the Arabs in Gaza, Judea, and Samaria. And that was a crime. Because PLO Fatah has been torturing the Arab Palestinians and destroying their minds and turning them into the kinds of monsters that we saw rush out of Gaza to commit the most unspeakable torture and crimes and murder in the south of Israel. So yes, I think the Israeli state and Israeli society have responsibility for what has happened to the Arab Palestinians. And what is the debt owed by Israel to the Arab Palestinians? I believe very strongly that Israel must defeat utterly the terrorist organizations, Hamas and PLO Fatah, in order to protect and restore liberty to the Arab Palestinians. The Israelis are the only people who can save the Arab Palestinians, because clearly nobody else cares about them. All of the people marching in our streets and in our campuses everywhere in the West, calling for a free Palestine from the river to the sea, in fact, are on the side, whether they understand it or not, of these organizations that have been doing nothing but crush the Arab Palestinians. So the only people who can save them are the Israeli Jews. And in fact, as you saw Itamar Marcus in Palestinian Media Watch, the Israeli Jews appear to be the only people who actually care about the Arab Palestinians. So for the sake of charity and for the sake of moral obligation, historical moral obligation, I think the Israeli Jews should do this. They should utterly destroy these organizations and bestow upon the Arab Palestinians the blessings of an Israeli government. That doesn't mean a Palestinian state. That's not what I'm proposing. And they should also do it out of self-interest, because it is in the fundamental self-interest of Israeli Jews to make sure that these terrorist organizations are utterly defeated. That was made very clear on October 7th. I will take your questions. Thank you very much. And if you want to learn more about this,
thank you. Aquí normalito. Let me hold on to the mic and
Thank you so much for your presentation. Very enlightening. Now, who would you suggest would rule? I mean, it seems like the Israelis are unable and unwilling to rule Gaza and Judea and Samaria. Who would actually take over that vacuum if Israel is unwilling to rule over them, especially because of international pressure?
well, so what I am proposing is that Israel must be willing. It's the only thing that makes sense, both morally and for the naked self-interest of the Israeli Jewish population. It's the only thing that makes sense. We already did the experiment, right? So in 2005, the Israeli government ordered the evacuation of Gaza. And not only did the Israeli government remove itself from Gaza, but in fact, all of the Jewish inhabitants of Gaza were forcibly removed by the IDF. And Gaza was handed over to PLO Fatah so that the experiment of self-government in Gaza could take place. And what happened was that in 2007, PLO Fatah basically gave Gaza to Hamas. And the consequence of that is October 7th. Among other things, October 7th is just the latest. But clearly, we cannot afford this. I mean, clearly, the only way to preserve peace in Gaza is for Israel to run Gaza, at least for a generation. Because in order to protect the Arab Palestinians, which again I think is a moral imperative, they have to be educated by institutions that are not controlled by terrorists, by totalitarian terrorists. So the only way to protect these people is to take over their institutions and make sure that the terrorists cannot hurt them.
Follow-up?
Yeah.
Would you agree that that would be a difficult thing for the world to accept?
Oh, well, when you say the world, what do you mean?
International pressure to have Israel not rule Palestine.
Okay, so international pressure is different from the world. There's a recent poll that found that 70% of American citizens favor Israel. They're supporting Israel in this world. 70%. So at least 70% of the United States, I think, could live with that. Now, when we say international pressure, we're actually talking about a very tiny group of people who are the people who make state-level decisions in these different countries. It's possible that those people will screech and hurl and yell and complain and rend their clothes and so on and so forth. But we know they're going to do that anyway, right? I mean, so Israel the Israeli government evacuated itself and every Jew from Gaza under the interpretation, a public interpretation, that this was the way to show to the world that Israel wanted peace. And the expectation was, well, now they'll see that we're the good guys, we're the nice guys. We're getting out of there, we're allowing the Arab Palestinians to govern themselves, right? And the outcome of that, in media terms and in academic terms, has been that in the media sphere and in the academic sphere, everybody still accuses that Israel is somehow occupying Gaza. So whether you actually rule Gaza or you get out of Gaza, the accusation is the same. If the accusation is going to be the same, you might as well occupy Gaza and make sure that Israel is safe.
Thank you, Francisco.
Yeah.
We know we have to learn from history, and of course, you say there's some blame for Israel. In a way, yes, I agree, but remember Arafat was expelled from Lebanon years before and brought back because he was the least, after the Ayatollahs Khomeini took over Iran and exported their Sharia all over the world, who do you deal with, okay? So this was the least, let's say, the more secularist guy to talk to and bring him from Tunisia back and started giving him something to deal with. To me, and years ago, talking to people with reasonable people, it's only the Palestinians themselves have to create their own, let's talk it, civil war and have the good people come out. It's the only way, because having terrorism or Hamas is a way of living for them. It's an income for them.
Okay, we need to get to the question.
Excuse me?
We need to get to the question.
Well, the question is a civil war among the what do you think about that?
Well, so, okay, so the reason, let me get back to this. The reason that my website is called The Management of Reality is that this is what I'm investigating. Okay? I'm investigating what is the relationship between the world that is represented for us in the universities and in the media and the actual world. What is that relationship? Now, clearly, Hazmi al-Husseini should have been a household word for everybody. Everybody should know about Hazmi al-Husseini. How is it possible that the Oslo Accords were signed and nobody knew about Husseini? Right? I mean, so when people were proposing the so-called Oslo peace process, they should have been told this organization that we are going to bring into the Jewish state was created by the Nazi exterminator of the European Jews. And then guess what? You can't bring it in. You can't say to the Israeli Jews and the Jews of the diaspora, hey, we have this new idea, let's see what you think. So there's this guy who killed all of the European Jews, 66% of them, right? And he created an organization whose entire purpose was to continue the genocide in the Middle East, in what is now Israel. And so what we're going to do is we're going to bring that organization into the Jewish state to run the lives of the Arab Palestinians in 3 militarily strategic territories, which is Gaza, Judea, and Samaria. Do you think that would have flown easily? Do you think people would have said, yeah, let's do that? Let's bring the organization created by the Nazi exterminator of the European Jews into the Jewish state, which was created to protect the Jews from Nazi genocides?
At the time, who would you suggest?
No. I'm asking you a question. Do you think that would have been possible if they had been told?
Historically, I agree with you. Historically, but at the time, you have to manage what you have on your.
All right. So let's get back to that. So you said at the time, PLO Fatah was the least bad of the options, right? Because Iran had just become, the new theocratic, jihadi terrorist state. And see, this is why studying the management of reality is so important. Because the other big thing that was hidden from you for decades now, although it was on the front page of the New York Times in 1979, in the period 1979 to 1981, this was famous. front page of the New York Times. I have another talk where I give you all the evidence on this. And you can go see my documentary on it later. But this is the fact. Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of Jihadi Iran, was put in power by Gil-White, by Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas. It was Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas who trained Ayatollah Khomeini's guerrillas in Lebanon in the early 1970s. And it was thanks to that training and to the weapons provided by Gil-White that Khomeini took power in Tehran. And right away, Gil-White became like a government ministry inside Iran. In fact, the very first dignitaries invited to Tehran to celebrate with Ayatollah Khomeini the triumph of the Iranian Revolution were Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas. Yasser Arafat was received in Tehran like the Mahdi, the Muslim version of the Messiah concept. People were just going crazy over Arafat. They wanted to tear off pieces of his kafiyeh to keep as a relic. So, no, Gil-White was not the least bad. How could it be? It had been created by the exterminator of the European Jews. So, no. What Israel has to do is defeat the terrorists. There is no option. There's just no option. So that's my answer.
Do you believe in a two-state solution? Let us keep the order.
Oh, we have an order back there. Sorry.
Yes, excellent, really excellent presentation. I want to continue this mental exercise about imagining a Palestinian state. As a comparison, you've made an excellent argument of how the Palestinian Authority or the Fatah or PLO treated Palestinians in the past. But one could make the argument that it was because of the presence of foreign entities like the British or Jews or whatever. If you imagine a state that would be free of Jews and free of this Western presence, then wouldn't it be important to compare to current state of affairs in other countries? And what do you think it would be a current free Arab state that would be a closest model of what a Palestinian state would look like?
Okay, so we actually have the historical comparison because the territory that was called British Mandate Palestine in 1920 and then radically redefined in 1922 had been ruled by the Ottoman Empire right before. And the conditions I described for the Feudal who were being oppressed by the landlords, the great landlords of that land, that was exactly the same situation. It just carried over into British Mandate Palestine, but it was going on right before as well. So, no, the Arabs didn't need the British to arrive in order to get the idea of oppressing those people. They were doing it already.
So, but my question was, so currently you want to compare what a free Palestinian state would look like. What is a good model of what it would look like in terms of current?
The free Palestinian state looks like. That's Gaza. So again, the Israeli government got completely out of Gaza in 2005. Completely out. So completely out that they even went in with the soldiers to remove any Jews from Gaza. Why? Because Gil-White, which is the organization that inherited Gaza after the unilateral disengagement, they will not tolerate the existence of a single Jew in the territory that they control. People talk about apartheid. You know, Israel is supposedly practicing apartheid. But you know, the state of Israel is 20% Arab, whereas Gaza will not tolerate a single Jew living there. So who's practicing apartheid?
So my question is, thank you, and that was a brilliant talk. So you say that Israel should get rid of the terrorist organizations and then govern Gaza. Does that include becoming a united state, like one state, and they become citizens? What exactly is this vision long term?
No, of course, that would be a terrible demographic problem for Israeli democracy. And obviously, there is no question of integrating people who have been indoctrinated into murder and terror and hatred anytime soon. There has to be a detox, and that's going to take a while. That's part of what saving the Arab Palestinians means. It means saving them from this indoctrination process. But no, the state of Israel should not assume the risk that it would entail making these people citizens. Of course not. Saving the Arab Palestinians is not the same thing as making them citizens of the state of Israel, and it's not the same thing as giving them a Palestinian state. What it means is saving their lives and saving their minds in the short and medium term from what these terrorists have done to them.
Yeah, I also wanted to thank you because I feel like it takes a lot of courage to do this.
I was a little afraid.
Honestly, I don't blame you. I would be too. I was actually a little bit afraid coming here today. I'm not going to lie. I'm Israeli, and it's scary, you know. So thank you.
Well,
I wanted to ask you. So people asked a lot about what's next after the war. There's an interesting proposal from an Israeli professor called Mordechai Kedar. I don't know if you heard of him.
I know him personally.
Okay, so he proposed the what's called the Palestinian Emirate solution.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you.
The Emirates.
Oh, sorry. So there's an Israeli professor called Mordechai Kedar, and what he said is basically, let's see what works in the Middle East, okay, where the mentality of the tribe is basically what dominates, and let's see what countries do really well, what countries do really poorly. And the countries that do really well in the Middle East are the Emirates, where they have the model of they come from tribes, and there's one family, clan that controls basically the state and provides for the rest of the country. And I wanted to ask you, what is your opinion about it? Because I do believe that in order to actually make progress, we need to understand, and you're doing a good job, basically history and who you're dealing with. So I just wanted to ask you, what's your opinion?
Well, Moti Kadar is a very smart man. He knows the Arabs very well. He speaks fluent Arabic, has been studying the Arab society for a long time. And his Emirate solution, in my view, is the smartest proposal anybody has put on the table. And what it means, essentially, is that in the future that he envisions, there would be some political autonomy, local political autonomy for Arab Palestinians in the disputed territories, but not a state. Right? So they would have some freedom locally to run their lives, but obviously anything that is of concern to the Israeli state would be handled by the Israelis.
By the way, I recommend everybody to actually read about it.
Well, he has a book on it, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting proposal, and actually tries to see what works and say like there are clans who actually already operate as Emirates, but it would also Israel and Arab villages. And Israel will rule, deal with those families as rulers of their own.
Right, and to come back to your question, what was happening before the Oslo process got proposed and initiated is that Israel was actually trying to find more moderate leaders among the local Arabs in the disputed territories, and they existed. They were in order to defend themselves, but they couldn't defend themselves from the PLO. And when the PLO came in as part of the Oslo process, all of those people got killed. So this is why I claim that yes, the Israeli government and Israeli society bear some responsibility for what happened, because the terrorists would not have come in without the consent of the Israeli government and Israeli society. However, I put the strongest onus of responsibility on the people running the Israeli government, not the Israeli population, because I can show that the people running the Israeli government did know about Hassan al-Husseini. I mean, look, it took me 2 weeks to document this stuff when I started investigating the history of the Arab Palestinian movement. It was all in the UPenn library. It was all in there. It was not exactly a secret. It's just that you don't know about this stuff because it doesn't occur to you that you need to go investigate. If the media is not talking about it, if the professors in the universities are not mentioning it, it never occurs to you that something really important is being hidden from view. But it was all in there, and it took me 2 weeks to document it. And so the people who did this in Israel knew what they were doing. They have a very important responsibility.
Under pressure of the U.S. too.
Sure, there was pressure from the U.S., no doubt. But I think that the obligation of an Israeli leader is not to please whoever was elected in the United States, but to please the people who elect him or her in Israel, and to make sure that they're safe.
Thanks. So the Arab world is, steeped in anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment. I think if you talk to most Arabs in the streets of most Arab countries, they will have extremely negative views in, Israel and Jews in general. And no matter what Israel does in Gaza or the West Bank or whatever entity may come, those Arabs are still part of an Arab culture. They speak Arabic and therefore are open to Arab media. And nothing that Israel can do, I think, or that an educational system can do in Israel will overcome a cultural pressure that's pervasive in the Arab world, as long as that's there. It seems like a very unlikely scenario that Palestinians living in Israel even 20 years from now are going to have any kind of positive feelings towards Israel if they're steeped in anti-Semitic Arab culture and they're getting this from external sources.
Well, you've identified something that is certainly a gigantic challenge. I agree with you there. But would you agree with me that those cultural aspects that you described are much worse in Gaza than they are among the Arabs who have Israeli citizenship inside Israel?
They're worse. I think that the ones living inside Israel don't have the violent tendencies, but I think there's a lot of kind of quiet support.
Okay, so but I agree with you. There's a little bit of everything among the Israeli Arabs, but I would say that the proportion of Israeli Arabs who actually want to live in peace with Israeli Jews is way higher than it is in Gaza. Would you agree with that?
It's not about living in peace, so it's accepting a Jewish sovereign state. I think the Israeli Arabs, a lot of them don't really accept a sovereign Jewish state.
Okay, well let's phrase it like that. Would you agree that more Arabs who have Israeli citizenship accept an Israeli sovereign state than the Arabs who live in Gaza?
No.
No? You don't think so?
There is not a single Arab leader, whether a mayor or press member, that would recognize the right of Jewish people to a nation home in the state of Israel, even if that nation home is only 1 square mile. The opposition to the state of Israel is ideological and include every Arab, including the Arab. You don't find a single Arab leader in Israel that would support the idea that the Jews have the right to a nation state, to a nation home.
Okay, so maybe we're reading different things or watching different media, but I've seen, maybe not leaders.
It's easy for you to believe that people.
Sure, but I have seen Israeli Arabs who have, not leaders, okay, but Israeli Arabs who have even posted videos on YouTube defending Israel. I've seen this. Very great.
It's very different when the individual does it.
No, I agree. What I'm trying to say is, I understand what you're saying about leaders, but I think it's still true that there is more of a positive feeling towards Israel among the Arab Israelis than among the people in Gaza.
It's true, but if it doesn't translate to political action, it's meaningless. If they're not able to translate it, if their politicians can't stand up and say it, if only people on the street can say it, then there's a problem.
Okay, so if the only thing you're going to win is that they don't kill you, that's still better. It's still better to have a Cold War, if that's what you think it is, with the Arab Israelis living inside Israel, than it is to have a hot war with Gaza terrorists who come out and perpetrate the crimes on October 7th. Right? So either way, I think the policy recommendation is the same. The terrorist organizations have to be destroyed. Right?
I have a question. Why?
I can't hear you.
Now? Better?
Could you put the microphone on your face?
I see. Sorry. Why, I come to your last point, would it be a good strategy for Israel to support non-terroristic organizations in Arab Palestine rather than try to solve the problem themselves? And why haven't the organization been created effectively?
Not sure I understood.
Because you mentioned that probably if Palestine, like in this like extreme example, when Palestine has become one state, then there will be these organizations that don't give.
Oh, you mean if Israel is erased and Palestine is created from the river to the sea? Is that what you mean?
I mean, this is an extreme case, but like I know that a lot of Arab Palestinians are against terroristic organizations that are created in Palestine.
How do you know this?
From Googling.
Oh.
From surveys.
Okay, so, well, the surveys actually give us a different result. So when people survey Gaza Palestinians, the support for Hamas is through the roof. Very, very high. Which makes sense because their minds have been poisoned by decades of very heavy indoctrination. You saw how they teach little kids in school.
But at the same time, you bring up people who are against the ruling of Hamas and other organizations. So there are people who are against it.
A few individual exceptions exist, sure.
And the collaborators have been like even...
Yes, and people they call collaborators are also opposing Hamas. And those people, when they catch them, they kill them. That happens too.
Would it be a good strategy for Israel to support this organization if their goal is to
Well, we don't, to my knowledge, we don't actually have an organization. So there is scattered resistance to Hamas inside Gaza. You're right, it does exist.
Yeah, so the question is why are there no organizations like this?
Oh, because Hamas kills anybody who tries to organize against Hamas. It's like saying, well, why didn't we have political parties opposing Adolf Hitler inside Germany after 1934, say? Well, because they had all been destroyed, and the Nazis would not allow them.
The point is that it's such a small minority that if Israel supported that small group, they would actually put them in a harm's way. Because they're a small minority and Hamas doesn't like it. So if, let's say Israel supported that using weapons, it's such a small minority that the majority would just, and that's their policy.
Yeah, so you have to take seriously.
And then you're getting actually the opposite.
Yeah, you have to take seriously that Hamas is a terrorist, totalitarian organization. So trying to organize against Hamas, as this gentleman is pointing out, is a surefire way of getting yourself killed. That's the problem. So now, of course, you're right that would be ideal. It would be ideal if Arab Palestinians who don't have this ideology could organize and become an alternative, a political alternative for the people living in Gaza. I agree completely with that. But the only way that can have any chance of happening is if the Israeli state first destroys the terrorist organizations that are oppressing these people and produces a political space of freedom where, and for a while controls the institutions so that these people are not poisoned again. And then, after a generation, we can begin to see if what you're proposing is possible. But the way to get there is to support Israel in its war against the terrorists. That is, if we care about the Arab Palestinians, if we really care about the Arab Palestinians, if we don't want Arab Palestinian individuals to come to harm, then we should be supporting Israel completely in its war against these terrorists.
You should mention what happened when Hamas took power. Called a peaceful...
Yeah, they got killed. Yeah.
They killed thousands of people. That was a purge. A violent purge.
Can I just add one thing? The son of Hamas, the question is where does he live? He is opposing, is literally the son of one of the leaders. He was the oldest son and he was supposed to be a successor.
This is Mossad Hassan Yusuf.
Yeah, he was the picture there. He can't live over there. They would have already killed him. He's...
Well, we don't know, actually.
No.
It's a well-kept secret.
So that's
Next question here.
Would it be fair to say the reason we're here tonight is because of religious extremism? Jewish extremists, Muslim extremists, Christian extremists. And the best, and my proposal would be to totally separate the non-Jews from the Jews, two separate states, but I would have
let's place it as a question.
Let me answer the question, because the question was, would I agree that it's fair to say that we're in this situation because of extremism on all sides, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish? I think the answer is no. I think that if you take seriously that in Israel, 20% of the population is Arab, they have full Israeli citizenship, they have all the rights that Israelis have. In fact, they're superior to the Israelis because they have all the rights that Israeli Jews have, but not all of the obligations. So, for example, Arabs in the state of Israel they're not obligated to do military service. They can do it if they want, but they're not obligated to, okay? So, in a sense, they're pampered. They have all the rights that Israeli citizens have, but they're not obligated to defend the state with their lives.
Or if you're religious.
They can organize, produce political parties, vote in elections. They can hold office in Israel. They have a member of the Supreme Court that's an Arab Palestinian. So people talk about apartheid state. I'm like, well, what exactly do they mean by apartheid state? Gaza is an apartheid state. No Jew can live in Gaza because they will get killed. When you travel in Judea, this is an amazing thing. When you travel in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank, you see these signs, these red and yellow signs at the entrance of Arab villages. And the signs say the most incredible things. I mean, people from all over the world should be shipped to Israel just so they can see with their own eyes these signs. The signs say that if you're an Israeli citizen and you walk past that point, may God help you, because the Israeli state will not be responsible for you if anything happens to you in that Arab village. That's what these signs say. And effectively, those signs are warning off Israeli Jews. Arab Israelis are not in danger. It's Israeli Jews that are in danger if they go into Arab villages. This is officially recognized with a sign from the Israeli government that says, we will not protect you if you decide to walk into this Arab village.
It forbids the entry.
It forbids entry. Now, what does this mean? It means that officially these signs are saying that the Arabs in that village can kill any Jew who walks in. That's what the signs are saying in more polite language, right? So that's apartheid. These Arab villages where any Jew can be killed in Judea and Samaria are not protected. They don't have walls around them and barbed wire and security men patrolling all the time. They're just normal villages. They gradually taper off into the countryside. Whereas the Jewish villages in Judea and Samaria all have walls and barbed wire and guards patrolling. Why? Why this difference? Because the Jewish villages in Judea and Samaria are routinely attacked with violence by Palestinian terrorists. Whereas the Arab villages in Judea and Samaria are not routinely attacked by Jewish terrorists. So you ask me whether it's fair to say that there's extremism on all sides. I say no. I think there's extremism on the Muslim side. And by the way, just last night, 2 nights ago, a friend of mine sent me videos. She's living in Samaria, and she sent me videos of a shootout in the middle of the night when Ramadan began. There was 2 hours of machine gun fire against the village just because Ramadan began. So this is the situation the Jews in Judea and Samaria have to live with. I don't think extremism is the same on both sides.
That points out the rationale to separate everybody. Separate the non-Jews from the Jews, have 2 separate states, And what's
Well, I-
needed, what is needed, however, is a UN peace mandate.
Okay,
And I would propose US-led
I'd like to answer this.
NATO
Hold on, I'd like
forces
to-
in the Palestinian state to make.
Okay, we have to have questions.
Coordinating with.
Forgive me, I have to stop you. We have to have questions, not speeches, sorry. So I'm the one who gets to do next speech, sorry. But I do want to address what you said, because it's very important. We actually have historical data on this. Historical data. So what you proposed was tried in 1947. In 1947, the UN proposed the creation of two states, not one state, two states, like you're proposing. And so the proposal said, well, let's make on the territory of what remained of British Mandate Palestine, because they had already removed 75% of the territory, but in what remained, they said, let's make two states. Yeah, so I have the map right here. Okay, so let me show the map. So they said, let's make a state for the Jews and a state for, no, I have it in the video. So they said, make a state for the Jews and a state for the Arabs, right? The Jews said, let's do it. The Zionist Jews said, okay, we accept this proposal, even though what was being proposed for them was just 1/8 of the territory that had originally been proposed in 1920. The Arabs said, no. Al-Husseini, speaking for the Palestinian Arabs, and in agreement with all of the leaders of the Arab states, said that the Arabs did not want an Arab state in Mandate Palestine. What they wanted was to exterminate the Jews. Azam Pasha said it very clearly. So the problem with creating a Palestinian state and separating the Jews and the Arabs into two different states is that there's every reason to expect that that state would devote itself to murdering innocent Israeli Jews, as the independent state of Gaza did on October 7th.
I don't disagree with you. And
I have
what
to stop.
I'm
I'm
saying
sorry.
is let's have a UN peace mandate, US-led NATO forces, boots on the ground in the Palestinian state.
Okay, well, the problem with that proposal, look, we have UN troops. We have UN troops on the Lebanon border. It's called UNIFIL. What good is UNIFIL doing? There's a hot war going on between Hezbollah and Israel as we speak, and it's not the first time. So if there were any reason, any historical reason to expect that the UN will protect the lives of Jews, let me finish, please. If there were any historical reason to expect that the UN will protect the lives of Jews, your proposal could be considered. But in fact, it was UN personnel, UNRWA, the personnel from the UN refugee agency that is dedicated to the Arab Palestinians, personnel from that UN agency participated in the massacre of Jews on October 7th. So any proposal that says we're going to trust the UN to protect the lives of Jews is dead on arrival.
I'm not proposing that. I'm saying.
Sorry. Let's cut it off, please, because there's many other questions.
NATO.
The question begs to be asked, Francisco, about the loss of Palestinian lives in this process of getting rid of Hamas.
Okay, so what is the question?
The question is, what do you think about this cost, and because this is one of the biggest arguments of media and of pro-Palestinian supporters
Okay,
in
so
the
what do I
US.
think about
Say to
the
them?
human cost on Arab Palestinians of the current Well, I think it's a terrible tragedy. I think it's a terrible tragedy that all those Arab Palestinians are dying as a result of this war. But there's no question that this is a just war, and that the Israeli state has to destroy these terrorist organizations for the good of the Arab Palestinians too. Because even though it is true that a number of Arab Palestinians are dying in this war, that's true. But Arab Palestinians are going to be crushed completely if Hamas stays in power. So it's not as if not having this war is somehow going to spare the Arab Palestinians. The Arab Palestinians are being destroyed. The Arab Palestinians were being destroyed already on October 6th. So, yeah, I mean, true, Arab Palestinians are dying in this war, that's a tragedy. But it's something that Israel must do for the sake of both Israeli Jews and Arab Palestinians. Israel must defeat Hamas. So if when people say, hey, but what about all these people that are dying? Well, I think the answer is, look, in every war, innocent civilians die. It's unavoidable. The question that matters is whether the belligerents are trying to kill them, and whether one of those belligerents has a just cause. These are the moral questions that matter. The Israeli state has made tremendous efforts to spare the lives of Arab civilians caught in the crossfire. They make thousands of phone calls, send thousands of emails, drop millions of leaflets explaining to people where they have to run to before they do an operation. They say where the operation is going to be, get out of there, blah, blah, blah. All of that destroys the Israeli element of surprise and therefore puts Israeli soldiers' lives in danger. But the reason the Israeli state does that is that Jews are actually an ethical civilization. Jews have a culture and a moral center that is based on the tradition of the Torah. And as Rabbi Hillel famously said, this is the most famous rabbi, the most influential rabbi of all time, Hillel the Elder. He said that all of Jewish thought and ethics and law, etc., comes out of one commandment, Leviticus 19:18. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Right? Well, that's what the Israeli state is doing. Now, they're certainly trying to protect the lives of innocent Arab Palestinians. You can't protect them all. It's hard to protect them because Hamas has a military doctrine where they use Arab Palestinian civilians as human shields. So yes, it's a tragedy, but the responsibility for this tragedy lies squarely on the shoulders of Hamas.